level?
Oh, yeah, one guy, I don't know, big, white hair. I saw him come in the office once, but he looked out of place, you know, like a society guy. And I can't remember his name, but Oswald was with him. But he had something to do with money, because Bannister, you know, you never kiss anybody's ass. Ooh, he kissed his. I don't Clay something. Yeah, that was his name, Clay.
Veteran?
Carlos Marcello was more than just a crime boss. He was an architect of an invisible empire, stretching far beyond the swamps of Louisiana into the booming metropolises of Texas. And no city in the Lone Star State mattered more to him than Dallas. Dallas had no mafia family of its own, no native boss pulling the strings. It had gangsters, sure, gamblers, bookies, racketeers. But when it came to true power, it was a satellite of New Orleans. And in the world of organized crime, satellites didn't orbit on their own. They answered to one man. Marcello had spent years cultivating his grip over Texas, his influence creeping into every crack of the state's underworld. By the early 1960s, his network had become an independent, elaborately insulated operation, as one law enforcement official later put it. The Marcello machine ran smoothly. Gambling, slot machines, narcotics, real estate, and a pipeline of bribes that kept the political machinery oiled and obedient. By 1963, Marcello's racing wire service fed hundreds of bookmakers in Houston, with each one paying up to $500 a day for access. It was the same playbook he had used in Louisiana. Bankroll the bars and restaurants that would install his machines, finance the clubs and motels that would house his operations, and build a network of trusted men who could keep the operation running without his direct involvement. The money was staggering. Even a decade later, the Texas State Attorney General reported that Marcello's gambling syndicate in the state numbered over 800 bookmakers, handling revenues in the millions. And that was just what was known. But gambling was only part of the equation. Marcello had a foothold in industries that were far more difficult to trace. The Pelican Tomato Company, for instance, was one of the biggest importers of tomatoes from Mexico, its largest single customer none other than the US Navy. It was a legitimate front, but one with a darker underside. Customs officials looked the other way, and no one dared to ask what else might be getting shipped across the border. The Marcello influence wasn't just economic, it was political. Texas had been bought and paid for, one campaign at a time. His key bagman in the state, a man named Jack Halfon, made sure of it. Halfon funneled a portion of Marcello's illegal profits straight into the pockets of Texas power players, men like Houston Congressman Albert Thomas, Supreme Court Associate Justice Tom Clark, and, most notably, U.S. Senator Lyndon Johnson. It was estimated that at least $50,000 a year from Marcello's gambling profits alone ended up in Johnson's coffers. And, in return, Johnson helped ensure that any federal legislation that might harm Marcello's business interests never made it out of committee. With Vice President Johnson in his corner, Marcello had a protective shield that even Robert Kennedy's war on organized crime couldn't penetrate. Dallas in 1963 was Marcello's playground. The police? Bought. The politicians? Complicit. His enforcer? A Sicilian-born, Louisiana-raised gangster named Joseph Civello. Civello had been a key figure in the underworld for decades. A bookmaker, a liquor dealer, a suspected murderer, and a narcotics smuggler who had been Marcello's man in Dallas for years. He was so trusted that in 1957, when the top mafia bosses in the country gathered in Appalachian, New York, it was Civello whom Marcello sent as his personal representative. He returned to Dallas to a storm of negative press, but the heat didn't last long. The city's police force, which had long ignored his dealings, kept his name out of any real trouble. And then there was Jack Ruby. 6 years after Appalachian, Civello's influence still ran through Dallas like a live wire. He was leasing Marcello's slot machines, running the racing wire service, and keeping a tight grip on the local underworld. He also had close ties to another Sicilian family in the city, the Campisis. Joe and Sam Campisi were restaurant owners, but their Egyptian lounge was far more than just a place to eat. It was an underworld meeting ground, a place where deals were made, and where men like Civello came and went through the back door, unseen by the general public, but well known to the FBI. One name that would later surface in connection with the Campisis: Lee Harvey Oswald's killer. In the days before he shot Oswald in the basement of the Dallas police headquarters, Jack Ruby ate dinner at the Egyptian lounge. The Campisis, like Civello, had been long-time friends of Carlos Marcello. The connections were deep. Too deep. The FBI later found extensive phone records linking Marcello's enterprises in New Orleans to Campisi's restaurant in Dallas. And in 1978, when investigators finally questioned Joe Campisi, he admitted to a long-standing friendship with Marcello. He even bragged about how every Christmas he sent Marcello 260 pounds of Italian sausage, made special with walnuts and celery. By the time 1963 rolled around, the Marcello organization operated with impunity in Dallas. Their men weren't just bookies and club owners. They were embedded in the police force itself. One sergeant, Patrick Dean, was so deeply tied to the organization that he was spotted having dinner with Civello just days after the Appalachian meeting. That same Sergeant Dean would be in charge of basement security at the Dallas police headquarters when Jack Ruby pulled the trigger and silenced Lee Harvey Oswald forever. The Mafia had a saying: nothing is a coincidence. The Kennedy assassination was barely over before the coincidences began stacking up. Coincidences that in the world of Carlos Marcello, Jimmy Hoffa, and David Ferry weren't coincidences at all. One name kept surfacing again and again: David Ferry. Ferry, the bizarre red wig-wearing pilot with a penchant for young boys and high-stakes gambling. A man who had been close to Oswald since 1955, years before the world would even know the name Lee Harvey Oswald. A man who worked not only for Carlos Marcello, but whose name was whispered in CIA circles. And, if Frank Sheeran's story was true, a man whose role in the assassination was more than just a footnote. Sheeran, the Irishman, a trusted enforcer for Russell Bufalino and a confidant of Jimmy Hoffa, had kept his mouth shut for decades. But when he finally talked, the details were staggering. In 1963, Hoffa had sent Sheeran on a delivery. A duffel bag containing 3 to 4 rifles, flown from Baltimore to a destination unknown. Sheeran, never one to ask too many questions, didn't open the bag, didn't handle the weapons. But he knew what they were for. A contingency, a backup. Because things like this needed backup. The FBI file on Tony Provenzano backed up Sheeran's story. On the exact date Sheeran claimed he made the drop, an Irish-looking individual matching Sheeran's description was seen picking up a rucksack under surveillance. Coincidence? Not likely. The November 21, 2015 documentary Capturing Oswald filled in more gaps. Detective Jim Livell, the officer handcuffed to Oswald when Jack Ruby fired the fatal shot, dropped the bombshell. They had laid out 3 or 4 routes to take. The president's motorcade had multiple possible paths, any of which could have been chosen at the last minute, which meant backup rifle teams were necessary. The Baltimore Rifles, one of those contingencies. Then there was Sergeant Patrick Dean, a Dallas police officer with deep ties to the Dallas underworld. Dean had sat down with Joseph Civello, the head of Marcello's Dallas operations, just days before the assassination. And who was in charge of Oswald's security detail once he was arrested? Sergeant Patrick Dean, the same Sergeant Dean who was the planted witness for Melvin Belly, Jack Ruby's lawyer. The same Sergeant Dean who, it's now believed, was the man who leaked the final motorcade route to his Mafia co-conspirators. Because if there were 4 potential routes, the Mafia needed to know which one would be chosen. And someone inside the Dallas Police Department had to give them that answer. Oswald was on the inside. He knew which route was his responsibility. He had his own rifle, the one he was comfortable with, but he was never meant to survive past Sunday morning. Jack Ruby, Marcello's man, made sure of that. Years later, the Warren Commission would dismiss any organized crime connection to the assassination of John F. Kennedy. But those who had spent their lives studying the underworld knew better. Dallas was Marcello's city. His men controlled the rackets. His men controlled the police. And when the most shocking event in modern American history unfolded in the streets of Dealey Plaza, his network was already in place. But even before the shots rang out in Dallas, the winds of change were blowing. By the mid-1970s, law enforcement agencies were finally starting to put the pieces together. The Texas Organized Crime Prevention Council identified over 160 men in the state with Mafia ties, 32 of them full members. The Associated Press launched a probe into the state's underworld, interviewing a former Mafia leader who had come to Texas looking for a fresh start, only to find that the mob had beaten him there. "It's a great big watermelon," the man told the reporters, "ripe for the plucking." The pluckers had arrived. Even beyond the old Marcello network, fresh players were making moves. The West Coast Mafia was beginning to challenge the New Orleans hold over Texas. Old alliances were fraying, and rival factions were circling. In a Dallas hotel club, an aging East Coast mobster sat down for dinner, his .38 caliber pistol hidden beneath a red napkin, watching, waiting. The mobsters in Texas, he said, were getting ready for the day when gambling would be legalized in the state. Massive land holdings had already been secured, bribes had already been paid, and politicians had already been bought. But the key to everything? Getting the right people in your pocket. Carlos Marcello had done that better than anyone. Even as law enforcement cracked down, even as new enemies emerged, the little man of New Orleans still had his grip on Texas. His name was whispered in connection with a real estate empire tied to the mob. His men still controlled gambling rings in Dallas and Houston, and his people still moved money through seemingly legitimate businesses. But the clock was ticking. Federal prosecutors were coming after him. Investigators were digging deeper into his ties to politicians and businesses across Texas. The headlines were catching up to the rumors. And for the first time in decades, there was the hint of something Marcello had never had to deal with before. A war on the horizon. While the world's eyes were on Dallas, where President John Kennedy's motorcade rolled through Dealey Plaza, something else was unfolding in New Orleans. In a federal courtroom, Carlos Marcello, the man Bobby Kennedy once called the most powerful racketeer in the country, was watching the final act of his latest battle with the United States government. The stakes? Conspiracy charges. The government claimed Marcello and his brother Joseph had cooked up a phony Guatemalan birth certificate, a slick maneuver from back in 1956, meant to throw off the feds who were trying to ship him to Italy. The whole case reflected the government's obsession with Carlos, an obsession that wore Bobby Kennedy's fingerprints from top to bottom. 2 weeks the trial ran, and by that Friday morning they were almost at the finish line. U.S. District Judge Herbert Christenberry had already knocked down the defense's motion for an acquittal. The case was going to the jury. But the government's star witness, a man named Carl Irving Knoll, and Knoll was a problem. Knoll was a classic hustler, a con man, according to Mrs. Yvonne Klein, a woman from Wilmette, Illinois, who torched his credibility on the stand. Knoll had claimed he bribed Guatemalan officials to get Marcello's fake birth certificate, but Mrs. Klein told the jury that Knoll had actually made those trips for her, tied to some grand, far-fetched $200 million building project. The government's carefully built, started to sag under its own weight. But then came the timing. That timing. As the jury deliberated, the news broke from Dallas. The president, Bobby's brother, shot, dead. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, but the proceedings didn't stop. Marcello, stone-faced, watched and waited. Carlos Marcello sat in his office at the Town and Country Motel, his inner sanctum, surrounded by men who had seen wars waged in courtrooms, alleys, and backrooms. He had beaten the United States government, embarrassed Robert Kennedy, and walked free on the very day the President of the United States had been shot dead in Dallas. Fate, it seemed, had a twisted sense of irony. Then the news came. A phone call. A whisper in the ear. Dutz Murrett's kid had been arrested in Dallas. The name didn't mean much to most. But to Marcello, it did. Lee Harvey Oswald, the boy from New Orleans, a nobody, a drifter, but now a suspect in the most explosive murder in American history. If Marcello had any connection to the assassination, if there was even the faintest trace back to him, then Oswald's arrest wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a catastrophe. He had spent years building an empire that stretched from New Orleans to Dallas, Houston to Shreveport, Baton Rouge to Miami. It had survived deportation, FBI investigations, and Senate hearings. But an empire was only as strong as its weakest link. And now Lee Oswald was sitting in a Dallas jail cell, facing police officers, and God knows how many federal agents. Carlos Marcello knew what needed to be done. Inside the interrogation room at Dallas Police Headquarters, Lee Harvey Oswald sat under the harsh glare of overhead lights. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, the walls vibrating with the chatter of reporters, officers, and federal agents scrambling to make sense of the unthinkable. The President of the United States was dead, and the suspect sitting in front of them was an enigma wrapped in contradictions. A former US Marine who had defected to the Soviet Union, only to return under bizarre and unexplained circumstances. A man who had recently been in New Orleans, causing a scene with pro-Castro leaflets, and yet was deeply connected to the very forces that despised Castro the most. A man who, in custody, kept repeating one phrase over and over: "I'm just a patsy." As the interrogation stretched into the night, Oswald's family began arriving at the police station. First his mother, Marguerite Oswald, a woman who talked fast and had no filter. From the moment she arrived, she was loud, insistent, and unapologetically conspiratorial. "My son," she declared, "was working for the United States government." The detectives barely reacted. Half of them thought she was just another overdramatic mother in denial. But as she kept talking, some of them found themselves shifting in their chairs. "He was a patriot," she insisted. "He went to Russia on behalf of the CIA. He was sent there. And now they're trying to blame him for something he didn't do." It sounded insane, but decades later, investigators would discover that she wasn't far off the mark. Oswald had ties to the CIA. Oswald had been part of intelligence operations. And Oswald was not just some random drifter who snapped one day and killed the president. To Carlos Marcello, however, that's exactly what Oswald would have looked like. A nobody, a hothead, a man who had been in the wrong places, at the wrong times, with the wrong people. But Oswald's past wasn't as simple as it seemed. Before Dallas, before November 22nd, 1963, before his mugshot was plastered on front pages across the world, Lee Harvey Oswald had been in New Orleans. And in New Orleans, Oswald had been part of something bigger. He had ties to men like David Ferry, a CIA-linked pilot who worked for Carlos Marcello, to men like Guy Bannister, a former FBI agent turned anti-Castro extremist with an office at 544 Camp Street, the same building Oswald used for his so-called pro-Castro organization. Oswald had been part of something that, on the surface, made no sense. He was openly handing out pro-Castro leaflets, yet he was surrounded by anti-Castro operatives. He was loudly defending the Cuban Revolution, yet he had been spotted in the company of anti-Castro Cuban exiles. He was arrested for a staged street fight with Cuban exiles, but instead of quietly leaving, He demanded to be taken to the police station and filed paperwork. Why? Because Oswald was building a cover story. The DRE, Directorio Revolucionario Estudiantil, a Cuban exile group funded by the CIA, was running a misinformation campaign in New Orleans, and Oswald was a piece of that puzzle. The staged fight, the pamphlets, the arrest, it was all an act, a way to paint Oswald as a radical nobody, a pro-Castro lone wolf. And when the time came, that false persona would be his death sentence. Because the moment Kennedy was shot, Oswald's past wasn't going to be investigated, it was going to be used against him. By Saturday, November 23rd, as the nation mourned its fallen leader, David Ferry, one of Marcello's most trusted operatives, was already moving. Ferry had left New Orleans in the early evening of the 22nd, tearing across the highway in a light blue Comet station wagon, a Texas thunderstorm raging overhead. By 4 in the morning, Ferry and 2 companions, Alvin Bobeuf and Melvin Coffey, pulled into the Alamo Motel in Houston, a property owned by Marcello. Exhausted, soaked, but on a mission, Ferry wasted no time. He placed a call straight to the Town Country Motel in New Orleans. The FBI later claimed Ferry called Marcello's attorney, Ray Gill, but Gill wasn't supposed to be there that Saturday. And he wasn't. The call, almost certainly, was for Carlos Marcello himself. That weekend, Joe Matassa, Marcello's partner in the Pelican Tomato Company, was in a panic. He had promised ex-juror Rudolf Heitler a payoff for his not guilty vote in Marcello's trial. But now, Matassa couldn't reach Marcello. "He's laying low," Matassa told Heitler. "He's hard to get a hold of." And that was true. Marcello disappeared. The Town Country Motel had too many eyes, too many phones tapped, too many informants lurking in the shadows. If Oswald's name meant something, if Ferry's desperate drive to Texas meant something, then Marcello needed to be somewhere no one could reach him. He had a fortress for moments like this. Churchill Farms. That's where he likely went. His vast 6,000-acre compound outside New Orleans, a place where men came in but never came out. There, far from reporters and wiretaps, he could work in silence, letting the cleanup unfold on its own. Meanwhile, David Ferry's name was about to explode onto the front pages. The night of the assassination, Ferry's longtime associate, Guy Bannister, got into a violent bar fight with an investigator named Jack Martin. Bannister was a former FBI agent turned private investigator, running his operation out of 544 Camp Street, a building that just happened to be linked to Lee Harvey Oswald's Fair Play for Cuba committee. The fight started over money, but as the argument escalated, Jack Martin, drunk, angry, and maybe scared, blurted out something chilling. "What are you going to do? Kill me like you all did Kennedy?" Bannister snapped. He grabbed his .357 Magnum, pistol-whipped Martin across the face, and beat him until blood ran down his scalp. Martin didn't call the police that night, but the next day he started talking. By Sunday, November 24th, Jack Martin had reached out to a friend in the New Orleans District Attorney's office. He had something to say about the Kennedy assassination, and it had to do with David Ferry. By Monday, November 25th, the New Orleans police, FBI, and Secret Service were all looking for Ferry. Jack Martin's tip had made its way to Assistant District Attorney Herman Coleman, and suddenly, Ferry's rush to Houston didn't look so innocent. Where was Ferry? Carlos Marcello's lawyer, Ray Gill, suddenly had the answer. "Ferry's been in Texas," he told the DA's office, "but he'll be back in New Orleans soon." When Ferry finally turned himself in, he played it cool. He claimed the trip to Texas had nothing to do with Kennedy. He had just gone ice skating in Houston. It was the weakest excuse in the history of alibis. The FBI interrogated him. Secret Service grilled him. But they had nothing to hold him on. Ferry walked free. A cleanup complete. Oswald is silenced. But the real problem, the biggest problem of all, was still sitting in a Dallas jail cell, Lee Harvey Oswald. Marcello, if he were involved, would have known that Oswald needed to be silenced. Immediately. And that was a job that could only be done by someone inside the Dallas underworld. Enter Jack Ruby. Ruby was no lone gunman. He was a mob-connected nightclub owner, a man who had done business with the Campisi brothers, Joe and Sam, longtime Marcello allies. On Sunday morning, November 24th, 1963, Ruby received a mysterious phone call. Moments later, he grabbed his Colt Cobra revolver, left his apartment, and headed to the Dallas police headquarters. At 20 minutes past 11 in the morning, as millions watched on live television, Ruby pushed through the crowd, raised his gun, and fired a single bullet into Lee Harvey Oswald's gut. Oswald gasped, fell, and died less than 2 hours later. The weakest link had been severed. Years later, House Select Committee investigators would dig deep into Marcello's Dallas connections. They found that Oswald had ties to New Orleans. Oswald had been linked to David Ferry as early as 1955. Marcello and Ferry had an airtight alibi for November 22nd, but crime bosses always arranged airtight alibis before big jobs. Jack Ruby was a longtime associate of Marcello's Dallas contacts. And yet, Carlos Marcello never spent a day in prison for anything related to the Kennedy assassination. Because in the world of organized crime, the best killings are the ones you never have to explain. Carlos Marcello, the little man, had cut off the head of the dog and lived the rest of his life in the shadows.